Okay, well, why don't we start with some questions that I have, based on what I saw of your presentations earlier. And let me start with Mike, and then maybe some other people can add to this. What can businesses in Hawaii, who are kind of in the sectors that you talked about, do to mitigate risks associated with the macroeconomic forecast that we've seen? That is to say, high inflation or higher inflation, at least for a while, higher interest rates environment, and what may be some good strategies for them to deal with this situation?
Okay. It's a very broad question. From an investment perspective, we deal with developers and investors in real estate. So ultimately, an interest rate increase would have a deleterious effect on acquisitions, also on development, because when they borrow money to build something, the returns that they're anticipating are going to be negatively affected. So what we're seeing, as the forecast indicated, was a decline in activity, and ultimately, what Eugene mentioned is he's seeing a slowdown in construction permit volume, and I believe that's also being impacted because other than government spending, which apparently is a huge construction thing happening, private investors in terms of development are going to be adversely affected by that. From an office perspective, we're seeing negative impacts on labor, shortages from skilled labor in particular. We're seeing, as previously mentioned, hoarding. Yeah, we're hearing from our clients that they're not letting go underperforming workers, because if they did, they don't have anybody to do that job even if they showed up. So instead of laying people off, they're going to try to massage them and make sure that they're happy in the job, and then eventually, if businesses start losing sales, they're going to lay off their lower performing workers. Retail, it's been discussed at length in the earlier session. From the industrial perspective, we're seeing impacts on wholesale. Wholesalers are challenged by the rising costs for transportation, and they're a creative bunch as well. They're seeing ways to get around relying solely on Matson and Tasha and some of these others, and trying to ship goods here by air. They're doing containerized early shipping a year in advance to get the materials here so that they can actually go forward on projects. So we're seeing some creativity out there. It's just a very challenging time because you have seen price increases, labor shortages. All of these things that were mentioned in previous sessions are definitely impacting the business environment.
Other panelists have anything to add to that? Okay. Peter, having a good awareness of what's happening currently in the economy is really important to forecasting. What does UHERO do to have the best understanding possible of what's actually happening today, so you can better forecast tomorrow?
Yeah. So most indicators that come out that are released by the government or other agencies that collect data, they come out with a lag, and they sometimes come out with a long lag. And really, to understand what's going on, especially now in the last 2 years during the pandemic, when things were changing really fast on the ground, we turned to high-frequency indicators, many of which were made available by private companies that they didn't do it before. And so that's how we developed the UHERO Pulse, an index of, we started out with 20 high-frequency indicators, that means daily to weekly indicators, that came from different sources and pointed at different sectors, mobility, labor, and so on, retail, and essentially created a weighted average to have a general understanding of where does Hawaii is heading, and what are the economic conditions on the ground. So that's one way when you have access to a large number of high-frequency indicators. Unfortunately, Many of these private sources are now have now decided not to share that information anymore. So we are the pool of indicators that we can use for this shrinks. Another way that we assess conditions, for example, in the tourism industry, is look at proxies, like, for example, passenger counts, that we have information about passenger counts daily, and use that information to fill in the missing piece for a month or a quarter. And let me give you one more example that Eugene mentioned. The Bureau of Labor Statistics every year benchmarks the jobs numbers for the previous year. And they do this once a year in March. Now, in the meantime, you are relying on the data that's coming out, but it's the BLS acknowledges that it's not as high quality as some other data sources that they have. So what we do at UHERO, we get the other data sources and we do our own internal benchmarking to understand what might actually BLS do in March. So we are looking ahead and trying to estimate what the BLS benchmark revision is going to be in March. So these are some examples that we use for assessing conditions as we go in real time.
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to add to that?
I'll just follow up. Peter's right. The explosion of anonymized, high-frequency, most often daily or weekly data from private providers like Google and the credit card guys and the payroll guys and all of these different private companies, it was just kind of a spontaneous outpouring in response to the uncertainty associated with the pandemic initially. But of course, these data sets aren't developed as they are at BLS or BEA or even DBED and agencies that are responsible for producing the official data sets, albeit at lower frequency, in that the design of the data collection and understanding what the data actually tell you haven't been worked out over years and years or decades and decades. And for example, with the cost of living, the purchasing power parity index that the BEA now publishes, they publish about a decade of data, maybe a little more. I mean, I remember reading their papers on experimental measures of purchasing power parity back in 2005. And there was all this literature. It took them 10, 15 years before they even would publish the experimental estimates. They had the working papers out. So what's happening now, BLS and BEA and Census and others recognize that this transition is coming where the companies that were doing this out of the goodness of their hearts have changed their minds. Now, I don't want to pick on everybody. I appreciate that Bank of Hawaii sponsored, but as soon as internet came, you had to know that we weren't needed, you know what I mean? And First Hawaiian and Bank of Hawaii spent a number of years with Tian's crew at DBED going, well, here's how we do it, because internet's going to replace us, right? Internet will not replace us. And so BLS now recognizes and the government, statistical agencies recognize that this moment is coming, and they have been dedicating resources to figure out both how to replicate or do the gathering as a conduit through which the better quality data are allowed to continue to be produced. So look for that. For example, the BLS has been publishing a remote work, a telework series, and it showed women more than men, millennials more than boomers work from home. But it was specific to the pandemic, right? How many of you worked at home, people higher educational attainment and so on, as a result of the pandemic? Well, now they're going to broaden that. They just announced that. So I think the new September survey will be a broader measure that will show both because of the pandemic and in general, what's going on, which will inform on on an ongoing basis a lot of the questions we have with regard to office space, retail, and the redeployment of that space, and the changing nature, the composition of economic activity and whatnot. So keep your eyes open. This summer they were all making their announcements at the conferences.
Okay. Eugene, the labor market that you talked about is somewhat anomalous in the sense that there are many people who are not working or not in the labor force perhaps, and there's this real demand for work, and you can see it everywhere, signs in the windows everywhere. How do you explain that difference?
Yes, I think we actually did a survey. We have seen this phenomena, and we did a survey. We actually surveyed about 6,239 people. Then we found for this group, there is about 1.8% of them. They are in Hawaii, but working remotely for out-of-state firms. They are not available for Hawaii companies. And we have about 2.8% of them. They were payroll jobs, but now they are changing from payroll jobs to self-employed. So they are in the self-employed businesses. And we do have the largest group is actually the 3.7% of these. They are people unemployed, still looking for jobs. But I think the job opening currently is mostly in the health services, in the medical field, and in the professional, and in the tourism. So which means it's accommodation, food services, retail. But for the first two, medical field and also the professional, they need a lot of education. They need a lot of training. We really have a shortage. We don't have enough candidates. The people coming from out of the labor force, they are mainly coming from the government. They are coming from health services. These two are very aged in terms of all the industries. A lot of school teachers, they retired, and also from tourism. But the people now looking for jobs is in tourism. But those people, they don't want to go back to their, one of the indications from the survey is they don't want to go back to their old jobs. And they want to find something new, but it's still they couldn't find. I think a mismatch is one of them. And also we have people, they retire early, but they are looking, if the working condition is coming to fit their desire, they may come back. But the way they want to come back, they are looking at it about 30% this year, 40% next year. So there is something 30% in 2024. So it's going to take a few years to resolve this situation. So those people retire early may come back, and there's people retired permanently. And there is also a group of people, it's pretty high, it's 3%. They were not looking for jobs. They were out of the labor force even before the COVID. 70% of them, they were out of the labor force. They are not looking for jobs. And there is another group, the last group is people never work. And this group is in a high income. It depends on other family members' income, and they are looking, they can come back to the labor force, but when the condition comes, what condition? Higher pay, flexible arrangement, remote work, so the work will fit their lifestyle. So it's, I think it's the workers currently unemployed, they are more demanding in terms of condition. I think the mismatch is the main thing.
Okay, how about questions from the audience? Please.
Can you give me your professional opinion on what you think of the $300 gift to your checking account?
Yeah, we need more fiscal stimulus right now. We don't have enough inflation. Great timing, you guys. There was a pandemic 2 years ago. Let's do a fiscal stimulus.
Well, anybody want to take that on?
Yeah,
Well,
I should say hi to Dave from the Big Island. We were over in Hilo a couple months ago. First time I met him, and had a great chance to sit over lunch and talk about the new administration and their aspirations. But he said something interesting that I keep thinking about, because he said, "Oh yeah, brother, we got so much pandemic money left over," and I was like, "Bro, what?"
Yeah.
And that's, you see those government contract data in Tian's compilation. Now, a big part of that's 29 Los Angeles class nuclear submarines are going to be replaced by 29 Virginia class submarines, and that's going to take 10 or 15 years. But the other part of that is just leftover, Seth's sitting on a huge pile of money and can't figure out how to spend it. No, I don't know. That's, right? It's just, they couldn't spend the money fast enough. The unfortunate thing now is we don't, like right now, fiscal stimulus.
So are you saying that that maybe all this fiscal stimulus was an overreaction to?
Oh yeah, ARPA, we went at least $1 trillion too far. Right, it was 5 trillion, right? 2 trillion for CARES, 800 billion for Consolidated Appropriations Act, December 2020, and then another 1.8 trillion because Biden had to get in there. And now, completely different design, right? PPP, 80% of 800 billion went to the top 20% of households. What? What's that all about? So, well, and it's triage, right? You can't worry about how well designed your relief program is when you're about to go into the black hole of death. But coming out, we need to start shifting our focus. And the good news, to bring it to the theme of the conference today, is that a lot of the discussion is about infrastructure and long-term investment. I mean, this idea that, oh yeah, let's stick the school on the new guy, right? Who pays for the school? Oh, the new guy. We don't pay for the schools anymore, brother. Like the bucket who buy the new house, like, you got to pay for the house. You got to pay for the school. My kids power already. Why would I pay for school? You know what I mean? Where did that even come from, right? And they were talking about Guayaba Ridge this morning. Sorry, I got so many of these stories, but I'll just tell one more story. Remember they were talking about, oh, bro, the infrastructure. We're permitted. I met that guy one time. I went to the retirement party for the guy who is Guayaba Ridge. And he says, oh yeah, bro, I've been working on Guayaba Ridge 30 years, bro. And I said, really? Yeah, bro, this is my retirement party. I worked on it for 30 years. I was like, but you never built nothing, bro. I was like, what? Not my fault, right? I said, what's the hang up? So when people say, oh, the infrastructure cost, no, dude, they're talking about the bridge over Kipapa Gulch to the H2 freeway. Right? And this is a state where we punched 6 tunnels and built 12 lanes of divided highway to the windward side of Oahu when 2 people lived there. It's a completely different world we live in now. And so, like I say, the good news is at least the governments are talking about infrastructure. Like the Inflation Reduction Act, not because it's all about photovoltaic panels or something. Fine, just go do something. But the problem with infrastructure, when the dry docks have been increased in size, and the places the submarines park, I'm sure this is all in Donald Trump's secret papers or something, but there are 29 nuclear submarines at Pearl Harbor. Somebody translate that into Chinese, and we're going to get new boats. And that's going to go on all right through the 2030s. And that's big business, right? They spend $1 billion a year on submarine maintenance. Boom. So, yeah, it's great, but it's not building the capacity now. Do you see what I mean?
There's another question.
Okay. So we've had a net population loss in Hawaii for how many years? I don't even know how many
5,
years.
6.
Okay.
Wait till the revisions next year.
So
These guys are telling me.
what are your thoughts about the long term? I mean, how long can a state do that? And is that why we have a huge labor shortage? Is that part of the reason why?
Didn't I have in my slide? Didn't I had a wisecrack about that, right? Oh, bye-bye. Did you see that one? I'm waiting for Carly to, DBED, we got to wait for the intercensal revisions, right? Because the decennial census drops next spring. And so all those numbers are going to be revived. But I have a slide that I took out that shows what they are. I mean, it's a nice bar chart. And I don't think it's going to change qualitatively. Right, we'll get revisions to the numbers, but the 6 years of people leaving Hawaii on net, 6 years of residents leaving Hawaii on net. I mean, this is something, Tian is the first person I ever heard of that actually said this in public. I still won't say it in public, although you guys should come to the Hawaii Association of Realtors meeting in a couple of weeks. They might pry it out of me. Bro, if 50,000 people left Oahu in the last 6 years, There's your solution to the housing crisis. At 3 persons per household, that's the equivalent of all the housing units that were rebuilt on in the military base housing privatization initiative. 17,000 housing units. And you know what's happening over there? Because I was hanging out before all the Pearl Harbor guys got the real money. I haven't gotten my invitation to come back. They can't even fill those homes now, right? So who's next on the list? Retirees. Who's on the list after that? Military contractors. That's, I mean, this is not West Virginia where they're leaving because we're not going to mine coal anymore. This is Honolulu where people shouldn't be leaving Honolulu, but they are.
So just quickly add a little bit to this. So one of the reasons why we see this happening now is because the unemployment rate is lower on the mainland than in Hawaii. This is an unusual situation. Usually, Hawaii has a lower unemployment rate than the mainland, but now it's the reverse. So you have, as you saw in one of my slides, the labor market completely recovered on the mainland, better job opportunities, lower unemployment rate, and typically lower living costs, right? And so if you combine all these things, we have had population outflow even before COVID, but now this process just keeps continuing until we reach a balance where the amenities of Hawaii will compensate for the lower wages and the other things. And so in our forecast, which we'll publish in 2 weeks, as I mentioned, we will see at least a couple more years of weak or declining population growth, population decline. So yeah, so in the near term, that's going to happen. And of course, it's connected to labor force also, right? So that as population is flowing out of the state, that also means that typically the people who leave, at least in the first wave, are the ones who are not fully anchored in Hawaii. They came here, they tried their luck, they worked in the tourism industry, didn't work out. It's relatively easy for them to go back to the mainland. Those who were born and raised here, they have much stronger roots and they hang around for a longer period of time. So that's going to be another factor that's going to slow down this outflow of population.
I think it also relates to one of the sessions we talked about affordable housing. If the median home price is over $1 million, I can't afford a house, I got to leave. I can't live in my basement forever.
Sir?
Yeah, question on the inflation. Two quick questions. Paul, you've always talked historically about interest rates being a function of the real rate of return plus inflationary expectations. We've got inflation at 8%, but we have mortgage rates at 5.75. So you have an inverse there. So that suggests that the inflationary expectation is negative. Now, two things that I can't get my head around is one, our budget deficit was running about $1 trillion a year up until the last few years. It was up $3 trillion in 2020, $3 trillion in 2021, and it's going to be up another $1 trillion this year. So we're looking at a $30 trillion budget deficit, which is about $92,000 debt for every United States citizen. You have the US government unwinding their bond positions. You have China unloading their US debt. Net sellers of bonds, who's buying them? How do you see inflation going down when we see an extraordinary debt deficit being built by our government with all this deficit spending, and it doesn't appear to be changing under the new administration? How do you explain that?
Are you Sierra's dad? Are you Sierra's dad?
Yes, that's a disclaimer.
Nice job. His daughter's at Cornell now, but I've only met her like twice, and then we spent years on, she taught me Zoom, she did Zoom for the HEA, so props to that family. On the debt and the deficit, sort of, unfortunately, for those who are concerned about it, Japan kind of proved that we don't know what the actual limit is. You don't know until people start running away from your debt. And what's Japan at? 200% of GDP, 300? I don't even know now.
Above 200.
Huh?
Above 200.
It's above 200, and we're above 100. And we used to think those were scary numbers, and evidently they're not. Now, to be sure, a global pandemic is a time to do deficit spending, and those only come around once in a while. So while I don't worry about that too much, it is something that's of concern. I'll just leave it at that. The bigger concern being that the way we got out of it after World War II, for example, was with rapid economic growth, 4% productivity growth per year, right? You just, productivity growth, well, we don't have that now, right? Real GDP growth on trend will probably be 1.5 to 2%. I don't know what Peter's number is, 1.8. I think the CBO is at 1.8, and only half of that's productivity growth. So that's, the problem is we're starting with a big debt overhang in a world where it looks like the Industrial Revolution just ended. But working backwards, I also am not as concerned, although it's something we should be watching, about the math of real and interest rates and inflation expectations in the following sense. If you look at where if the Fed raises the overnight rate to 3.25, well, the Fed's at 2.5 right now. So think about this for example, for a moment. The overnight rate's 2.5. What's the Fed's long-run expectation of R star, right? The long-run neutral nominal rate? It's about 2.5%. It was 3, but we don't think there's going to be as much productivity growth, which means the real return on capital won't be as high. But for benchmarking, and the math is easy, round numbers, let's say 3. 3 is the number, and the number is 3. And then the inflation rate is going to be 2 in the long run. And there's no inflation risk. And people believe that the Fed will achieve 2% because we survey their expectations and we observe it. So now we're at, am I getting the math wrong here? 3, I'm sorry, I got the math wrong because 3 includes the inflation expectation. I'm thinking about the idiosyncratic risk that's associated with a mortgage, right? And that's 175 basis points. So that number is a 5 handle. So you've got 3% for the overnight rate. Let's call it a 5% mortgage rate, and we're closer to 6. 3 was too low, 6 is too high, 5 is the right number. And then what about the term structure? Let's go out to the 10-year point on the curve, or the 30. In a world with no inflation risk, there's no reason to be rewarded for parting with your money for a longer period of time. So in the dynamic long-term equilibrium, in the blissful turnpike of the future, everything should be at 3 plus a idiosyncratic risk premium. And if you look at home prices in Hawaii, adjusted for inflation, they appreciated about 2 or 3%, and then you get the dividend, you get to live in your house. So that's kind of a 5 handle or more. It all kind of aligns. It's possible. We've lived in this unusual decade where we were so close to the zero lower bound for nominal interest rates that we sort of forgot what the math was in equilibrium. And it's probably closer to 3% for the nominal risk-free rate, and maybe something closer to 5 for a market like mortgages, where there's a huge secondary, a deep pool of risk redistribution that allows for the intrinsic risk to be driven down as far as it's going to go. Yeah. Stop. So we could be headed, for right to where we need to be. I think we're going to have to overshoot, but yeah.
I think we're overshooting.
Overshooting the bar, are we? Oh no, we have another speaker.
Yeah, we have another. Okay, what time are we supposed to? Are we? No time for one Zoom question? Okay, one quick Zoom question. To what extent is Hawaii losing competitiveness or not to other Asian tourism destinations? Asia Pacific tourism, for instance, Singapore or something like that.
Where's Jen? Jen.
Just a quick thought on this. Obviously, the exchange rate plays a very big role in this, right? So
good point.
I mentioned this in my presentation, that if you're a Japanese tourist and suddenly you are looking at the weak yen relative to dollar, or we can call it a strong dollar, coming to the US is very expensive from your perspective. Perhaps Singapore, and I don't know that exchange rate, but if it's on par, or more acceptable, then that's a better choice for visiting Singapore. Yeah. So that's I think the main, currently that's the main issue, because at least in the past we were an attractive destination to Asian visitors, right? So this was a market that catered to many Asian countries, and so from that regard we shouldn't be worse off than 2 years ago. But the one thing that changed, that's the strong dollar.
2 words: Tokyo, Disney.
Okay. Couple more words. Thank you for our panelists. Okay.
All right. Seth started us off by noting how we are not going to, most likely, not going to have a lot of solutions at this conference, but we want to generate the discussion, we want to generate the questions so that the insights into the future come up organically from all of us here, and all of the conversations that we have with our colleagues and our friends and our families and our legislatures and our leaders in the future. I had a lot more questions to provide to hopefully stimulate discussion, but I'm not about to keep us too long here and away from the pub. So I do want to emphasize one thing. We've been talking all day about costs in a monetary sense, but James Buchanan, Nobel laureate and one of the founders of the Public Choice School, was very thoughtful about costs in more of the opportunity cost sense. The money we spend really represents the other opportunities that we give up. So these supply side costs, I really encourage you to think about them, not so much in terms of how the cost of living here is high, but in terms of who are the sons, daughters, uncles, aunties, nieces, nephews that could be living here if there was a house here for them that they could afford. Think about it in terms of who's that entrepreneurial friend that you have, or maybe it's you, that would pursue a new business venture if you could afford to wait 10, 12, 16 months for a permit. Try to think about these things in that sense to make it a little more real and a little more tangible, even though it's a very ethereal concept. All of that said, on behalf of the Hawaii Economic Association, I want to thank you for attending us either in person or online. Thank you very much to our conference committee chair, our fearless leader, Seth Colby, for putting this all together and having the vision to do this. Please join us at our October event. This will be on the October 27th, 12 to 1:15. It'll be on Zoom. We're going to have a roundtable discussion with representatives from all 4 counties talking about affordable housing. We want to continue these discussions, obviously. And last but not least, please continue this discussion with us at the Yard House up the street. Please see Leslie for drink tickets before you leave. Again, thank you very much. Have a good night.